Hey everyone, thanks for joining me today. Drop your city in the comments. Where are you tuning in from? I caught my son Daniel not with another woman, not stealing a trinket, but on a grainy airport security feed, boarding a first-class flight to the Maldives with his wife Jessica, and unbelievably, her mother Carol. It was the absolute gut-punching proof I needed. I'd been staring at a computer screen in the cold, windowless office of my accountant, Mr. Henderson, for the last hour, trying to make sense of the zero balance where my retirement savings should have been. My entire life, the house, my business, my future security, had vanished. Mr. Henderson leaned over the desk, his voice a low, grave whisper. "It's worse than the theft, Eleanor. They didn't just empty the account. They've been systematically draining your assets for almost 2 years, using a complex web of shell companies and forged documents. This wasn't a sudden mistake. It was a planned, malicious operation." That's when I saw the time-stamped photo. My son, beaming, holding a glass of champagne, having looted my life savings for a lavish vacation. The betrayal wasn't just financial, it was a total, crushing erasure of the man I thought I'd raised. The quiet life in St. Louis and the subtle cracks. My name is Eleanor Vance. I'm 54, a widow for 7 years now, and I own a small but well-respected independent bookstore in the historic Soulard neighborhood of St. Louis, Missouri. If you know Soulard, you know it's all brick sidewalks, jazz clubs, and a community that feels more like a big, nosy family. My store, the Gilded Page, was my haven, my legacy from my late husband, Arthur. He always said books were the only currency that truly mattered. My life was simple. Early mornings restocking shelves, late afternoons sipping iced tea on my porch, and Sunday dinners that, up until recently, always included Daniel. I'm not a millionaire, but Arthur and I were prudent. We had a substantial nest egg, $750,000, mostly invested in municipal bonds and a high-yield savings account, earmarked for my retirement and for the occasional necessary help for Daniel. He was my only child, a bright kid, but always a little entitled. He's 32, a marketing executive who always talked a big game about his startup idea that was just about to break big. Jessica, his wife, was a classic daddy's girl, focused on appearances and luxury brands, and Carol, the mother-in-law, a retired insurance adjuster from a wealthy suburb, was the real viper, cold, calculating, and always pushing Daniel to aim higher, which often meant spending more. The red flags, looking back, were so bright I'm ashamed I didn't see them. They started subtly, weaving their way into the fabric of our everyday lives. Daniel began asking for loans more frequently, not small amounts, $5,000 here, $10,000 there, always with a vague story about a critical investment opportunity or a brief cash flow problem at work. He'd always say, "It's a sure thing, Mom. I'll pay you back next month with interest." The interest never materialized, and the principal just evaporated into the wind. My accounting software, which Arthur had set up years ago, and which I only checked quarterly, started to feel a bit off. Sometimes the online login would be clunky, or a few files would look strangely renamed. I just chalked it up to a software update or my own technical ineptitude. I remember a specific morning, about 9 months ago, sitting at my kitchen table going through a printed bank statement. I noticed a large withdrawal, over $40,000, labelled simply Vance Estate Transfer. When I asked Daniel about it over the phone, he was instantly defensive. His tone, usually charming and casual, turned clipped and cold. "Mum, it's just the annual transfer to my trust fund. You know, tax stuff. Don't worry about the legalese, I'm handling it. Focus on those books, okay?" He had an uncanny ability to turn the conversation around, making me feel silly and overly dramatic for even asking. The conversation ended with me apologizing for bothering him. That's the nature of this kind of manipulation, isn't it? They make you doubt your own reality until you're apologizing for noticing their crimes. But the truth was that $40,000 wasn't the start. It was just the first time I got a full, cold view of the massive scale of their operation. The initial shock gave way to a white-hot fury, a rage so consuming it felt like I had swallowed a handful of hot coals. I wasn't just grieving the money, I was grieving the son, the daughter-in-law, and the entire future I'd envisioned. My first call wasn't to the police, but to my best friend Marcus Mac Delaney. Mac is a retired detective with the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department and now runs a private security consultancy. He's also the closest thing I have to family now, a loyal, pragmatic man who had known Daniel since he was a kid in Little League. Mac met me at my house the next day. The tension in my small living room overlooking the quiet street was deafening. I poured him a scotch, showed him the bank statements, the transfer records, and the final crushing airport photo. He sat there, silent, his face turning from shock to grim professional focus. "Eleanor," he said, his voice husky, "this isn't just one bad check. This is professional financial fraud. They've been running this con like a business." Mac immediately engaged a colleague, a forensic accountant named Anita Sharma. Within a week, she had peeled back the layers of their deceit like an onion, and every layer smelled worse than the last. The Vance estate transfer wasn't to Daniel's trust fund. It was the first deposit into a limited liability company, LLC, named Gateway Holdings LLC, registered in Delaware, a state notorious for corporate secrecy. The LLC was solely owned by Jessica and Carol. Daniel, who was supposed to be the family's sole heir, had provided the legal and banking access, but his wife and mother-in-law were the ultimate financial beneficiaries. This explained why Carol had been so involved in the financial advising of my son, pushing me to simplify my accounts with an online-only bank that was easier to manipulate. The investigation escalated quickly. It turned out Daniel had used his position as an executor of a small, forgotten portion of Arthur's will to get access to my primary bank accounts. He didn't just drain the savings. He had taken out a second mortgage on the Gilded Page storefront, forging my signature on the loan documents by claiming it was a refinancing opportunity to lower my interest rate. That storefront was my pride, my physical connection to Arthur, and they had mortgaged its future to fund their lavish lifestyle. The total loss, over $950,000, with the store now carrying a $200,000 debt I hadn't incurred. My emotional turmoil was a raw, aching wound. I stopped sleeping. I'd wander the bookstore at 3 a.m., touching the spines of the books, the only things that felt real. I kept thinking of the little boy who used to bring me dandelions, and I had to reconcile him with the sophisticated thief who'd stolen my life. There were days I cried until my eyes were swollen shut. There were nights I punched a pillow until my knuckles bled. But beneath the pain, a steel rod of vengeance began to form. They hadn't just taken my money. They had taken my trust, my peace, and my identity as a mother. I would not let them win. Mac, seeing my resolve, helped me devise a strategy. They were in the Maldives, smug, thinking they had pulled off the perfect crime. We needed to let them feel secure, while we built a waterproof legal case that would ruin them publicly and financially. Our plan had two prongs, the legal action and the public shaming. The legal prong was handled by a tenacious local prosecutor who saw the fraud for what it was, elder abuse and grand theft. Mac, using his old contacts, also discovered something crucial. Carol, the mother-in-law, had an Achilles heel. Years ago, she was forced to retire from her insurance job after an internal investigation flagged her for diverting client funds. It was a dark, hushed secret that never became a public charge, but the paper trail still existed. This gave us leverage. The public prong was my domain. I was going to use the one thing I had left, my community. The annual Soulard Bastille Day celebration was less than 2 weeks away, a huge televised event that drew the entire city and local news crews. Daniel and Jessica were expected to be back from their business trip just in time to host a big, flashy party they'd been planning for months, showing off their supposed success. I decided that's where I would strike. I gathered the evidence, the cancelled checks, the forged mortgage documents, Anita's detailed financial report and, most importantly, the bank's internal memo confirming my son had been granted temporary power of attorney under false pretenses. I also acquired the ultimate weapon, a copy of an email from Carol to Jessica, outlining the entire scheme and confirming their intent to leverage Eleanor's sentimentality to finalize the asset liquidation. The day of the Bastille Day celebration was sweltering, the air thick with humidity and the smell of beignets and cheap beer. The historic square was packed, with a local news crew doing a live segment on the parade route. Daniel and Jessica's party was being held at a high-end French restaurant on the edge of the square. They had invited hundreds of people, clients, friends, and the very community members they were trying to impress. I arrived precisely at 6:30 p.m., just as the local news cameras were setting up outside to interview a local politician. I was not invited, but I knew Daniel wouldn't be able to turn me away without a scene. I wore a simple black dress and my hands, though trembling, were steady. In my purse I had a flash drive and a neatly prepared press release. Mac was positioned across the street ready to intervene if things got physical. I walked straight past the flustered host and found Daniel holding court near the bar, looking impeccably tanned and utterly confident. Jessica, glittering in a designer dress, was beside him, and Carol was holding court nearby, sipping champagne. "Mum, what a surprise!" Daniel's smile was slick, but his eyes were instantly wary. He tried to steer me into a corner. "Yes, it is," I said, my voice cutting through the soft jazz music, strong and clear. The moment was mine. I didn't need to yell, I just needed to be heard. "It's a surprise to find you here celebrating when you know what you've done." Jessica scoffed. "Oh, here we go. Eleanor, please don't cause a scene." I ignored her. I looked Daniel straight in the eye and the mask of the successful businessman finally cracked. "You emptied my account. You stole my retirement. You mortgaged the bookstore. You stole $950,000 from the mother who raised you." The entire room went silent. People were turning, their cocktails halfway to their mouths. Carol, ever the pragmatist, stepped forward, her voice a low hiss. "Eleanor, you're delusional. This is slander. We'll sue you for every penny you have left." This was my cue. I had a small, portable projector hidden in a large gift bag. I plugged it into my laptop, which I'd pre-staged on a nearby empty table, and aimed it at a large blank white wall just behind the bar. With 2 clicks, the room was bathed in the harsh white light of Anita's forensic report. The final slide, the damning email from Carol to Jessica, with the subject line, "Liquidation strategy finalized," flashed onto the wall in 100-point type. The sheer audacity of the evidence was staggering. The email wasn't just a confession, it was a blueprint. Daniel lunged for the laptop, but Mac was faster. He appeared seemingly out of nowhere, blocking Daniel with a hand on his chest. The chaos that followed was a blur of gasps, dropped glasses and frantic whispers. The news crew, sensing a massive scandal, immediately turned their camera and boom mic toward the commotion. A reporter shoved her way through the crowd, shouting, "What's going on here, ma'am? Are these people defrauding you?" Daniel was pale, his face a mask of terror and impotent rage. Jessica was sobbing, clutching her mother, who was now screaming denials at the ceiling. I stood there watching the destruction of their carefully constructed facade, feeling not triumph, but a cold final sense of justice. Mac handed my printed press release to the reporter, ensuring the true story, the full $950,000 and the forged mortgage, was the only one that made the 10 o'clock news. The climax was swift and brutal. Within 48 hours, the story was everywhere, from the local St. Louis Post-Dispatch to national finance blogs. The police, armed with the evidence and the public pressure, moved quickly. Daniel, Jessica, and Carol were arrested. The legal battle was messy but ultimately conclusive. Faced with the overwhelming evidence, including the electronic paper trail and Mac's connection to Carol's past, Daniel pleaded guilty to a lesser charge of grand theft and elder fraud, hoping for a lighter sentence. Jessica and Carol, however, stood firm in their denials until the very end, claiming they were manipulated by Daniel. The judge, seeing the clear evidence of their financial orchestration, handed down a severe sentence. Daniel got 3 years, and Jessica and Carol received 7 years each, partially for the fraud and partially for the attempted cover-up. The sheer scale and calculation of the betrayal was a critical factor. The financial recovery was partial. The court ordered the liquidation of Gateway Holdings, LLC, which was enough to pay off the fraudulent second mortgage on the bookstore and return about $300,000 of my savings. I lost nearly $650,000 of the original nest egg, but the bookstore was safe, and I was solvent. My emotional healing is an ongoing process. I've had to accept that the son I mourned was a myth. The relationship is severed, perhaps forever. But I am resilient. My community rallied around me. My bookstore saw an outpouring of support. People bought books, donated small amounts to a legal fund, and offered emotional support. The Gilded Page is now thriving, a symbol of my refusal to be broken. I've learned that betrayal is a choice, but so is resilience. I am stronger, wiser, and more guarded, but I am not cynical. I am not defined by their theft, but by my ability to fight back and reclaim my life. I have my health, my business, my true friends, and the quiet dignity of knowing I stood up to the people who tried to ruin me. I'm starting a new chapter, writing my own story, one day at a time. If this story hit home, hit the like button, comment one below, and share your own story. Subscribe for more real-life narratives, and remember,